I love React hooks, and that's kind of tough for me to say. Like physically, my mouth keeps trying to say it as one word, like React hooks. But aside from that, it's also hard for me to say I love React hooks because sometimes using them can be really unclear, especially to new developers. And even as someone who's used them for years, I constantly find myself coming up with new workarounds and caveats with using them. Plus there's this whole history to them that you might not even know about if you've only started using them in the last few years. Or, heavens forbid, you're a normal person who doesn't even know what React is, or what hooks are, or who I am, or why I'm talking at you. Hooks like useState and useEffect are the basic building blocks of pretty much any functionality in modern React apps. But has it always been that way? No. Oh, there's meant to be a pause there. Hooks were only added to React in version 16.8 back in 2019. And bear in mind that React has existed in some form or other since about 2013. So at the time of writing this, the library has existed longer without hooks than it has with them. Yet despite being relatively new, they've effectively replaced all prior approaches within the library. And looking at the React docs for anything prior to the introduction of hooks gives you a big warning that this is legacy documentation and suggesting that you use functional components instead of classes. So let's briefly cover what those words even mean. Well, not really. If you don't know what function or class is, you might want to add this video to your watch list and then just Google the words first programming how to Part 1. Classy components. Long ago, React developers and class components lived together in harmony. Then everything changed when the functional components attacked. It was a blissfully ignorant time, where we would write our React components as classes, inheriting from the React.component abstract class, or the pure component class if you were feeling spicy. I think technically there was an even older way of doing it before JSX existed, where you had to call the create component function and pass in all the arguments like that, but that's before even my time, so we'll pretend that that doesn't exist. Yes, back in the olden days, class components were the standard, and it made sense since they were really intuitive if you're familiar with object-oriented programming. A single component instance on the page was tied to a single instance of the component class, and that made understanding this lifecycle really simple. When you mount a component, you get an object instance. That instance is just a JavaScript object which can be passed around and stored like any other. It can have a componentDidMount method that gets called when it mounts, a componentDidUpdate method for when it updates, a componentWillUnmount for when it unmounts. It was really clear what was happening at each stage in the component's lifecycle. But as well as having a really clear purpose to its lifecycle methods, you got access to this. I mean, literally, you could use the word this in the component. If you ever had something that you needed to persist for later in the component's lifecycle, any arbitrary data like a times button has been clicked for some analytics tracking, or screen dimensions, something that might be useful to you down the line for some calculation or data representation, but that you don't necessarily want to stick into state because you don't need it to cause a new render. You could just attach it to your component instance by assigning it to this. And then you could access those things from anywhere in the component, almost like a variable that's tied to a single instance of the class. I wish there was a name for that. Fast forward to when functional components started being used, which, and this may shock you, are not written as classes, but as functions. These functions were generally not designed to persist data like a class does, but to take a set of props and render something. These were like an offshoot of pure components, since they didn't have any local state, and they were simply just a way to transform existing data into JSX. And because of that, you don't have access to lifecycle methods, and you can no longer assign any data to this. Partly because arrow functions don't even have their own context of this, but even if they did, it's just not the way React components work under the hood. When you write a functional component, the function declaration may persist through multiple renders, but each instance of the function's execution happens in a bubble. We can't expect that any data present in one render will still be there in the next render. Each run of the function is basically just a pure render function, taking in the current app state and outputting some JSX. And so there's absolutely no way whatsoever to attach instance variables to a functional component. Part 2. How to attach instance variables to a functional component. Okay, so I wasn't lying, but that basically was the problem that held functional components back before the introduction of hooks. They were great as little one-off things for representing data or passing along interaction events to higher level class components that could actually do something with it. But you couldn't fill up a full React app that depends on state and context if all of the components themselves couldn't have any persisted data. So in my experience anyway, functional components were basically just a novelty, a less familiar way of writing a pure component, so you probably just shouldn't use them. And that's why hooks were such a big deal when they were released as part of React 16.8, because they gave you that missing functionality. They effectively allow you to have instance variables in a functional component, giving you the ability to store a local state, have what are basically instance methods, and stick any instance-specific data to that instance of the component, all without React truly having to persist any instances of the arrow function's execution. Now, I don't know what black magic the core React team had to perform to achieve this, and I truly hope Dan Abramov still has full ownership of his soul. But regardless, here we are in the present with an ever-growing list of built-in React hooks that serve primarily as replacements for the class lifecycle methods of yore. Need to run something once and only once when a component first mounts? Instead of the component did mount method, just put it in the body of a useEffect with an empty dependencies array. What about the opposite? Run only when the component unmounts? Well, instead of the component will unmount method, add another useEffect with the same dependencies array, but this time put your call in the function return from the useEffect body. Need to run something every time a component finishes rendering? Instead of component did update, guess what? Put it in a useEffect, only this time, don't provide a dependencies array. Wow, useEffect is kind of important and has a confusing API. Someone should make a video discussing how to understand it better, linked below. Part 3. Why bother? After all this, we've gotten to a position where functional components can do more or less everything that class components were able to do. So why did we bother switching over? Well, there's probably a bunch of reasons I've forgotten, but the main one I do remember is reusability. See, when every component was a class, if you wanted to imbue some other class with some trait, like making it being able to drag and drop, for instance, or making strings contained inside truncate nicer. Quick shout out to LocalBoast's truncate component and use truncate hook, links below. Or you just want any piece of functionality that a React component can do to be able to be applied to various different components without having to duplicate code all over the place. You had a few choices here. You could use a high order component, or HOC, or HOC, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, which was cool at the time, but has thankfully fallen out of fashion. These were functions that took other component definitions as arguments and returned a spiced up component definition that added some extra functionality and generally passed it through to the original component as props. For instance, if you wanted to make something work with drag and drop, you could make a with drag high order component, and when you create your list item component, say, you'd wrap the export in a call to with drag, meaning that what actually gets imported from this file is a component that renders an instance of the list item component and imbues it with dragging capabilities. Again, very cool, and I did love to use these back in the day, but they're way too complex for their own good. Another alternative was you could do something like use render props, which is a way to define a component that calls its own children prop as a function and passes it the data it needs to give the extra functionality. These were also very cool and really useful in certain circumstances. A personal favorite of mine being the auto sizer component from Brian Vaughan, linked below. But render props were needlessly clunky, and it had the staircasing problem, where every time you needed to add functionality to a component, this way you'd be further bloating your virtual DOM, or VDOM, potentially ending up with a staircase of components that simply pass functionality onto the component at the end. And this staircasing problem, which is generally present in both render props and high order components, as well as being inefficient since you have to make many component instances to handle the rendering of it, and as well as looking ugly in the debugger, it led to issues of conflicting names. Since a common practice for these was to pass the functionality on as props, if two wrapping components shared a prop name, they'd essentially override each other. Say for instance you wanted to give your component drag and drop functionality, but you also wanted to give it resize functionality. You might have a with drag high order component that adds, among other things, a handle prop that your component can use, and you might have a resize component that passes a bunch of properties such as handle. So you've imbued it with functionality from two wrappers, each providing a prop called handle, with two very different purposes. So whichever wrapper was defined lower down in the DOM would inevitably win, and bugs would ensue. All of this is where I think the beauty of hooks lies, letting you take the core functionality that would have been previously wrapped up in instance variables and lifecycle methods and isolate them to standalone functions called custom hooks. Now, if you want to add drag functionality, you can just write a hook called useDrag, and in your component that you want to add drag functionality to, you can just call useDrag, and now your component has that functionality right there without having to externally curry it in. Since we're not wrapping it in anything, our virtual DOM doesn't have to change, we don't end up with bastardized names or staircasing, and since any attributes passed back from the hook are declared inline, we don't have to worry about conflicting names, since it'll be immediately clear if that's happening, and we can rename it there and then. Like we could rename the handle attribute from our drag hook to drag handle, and the handle attribute from our resize hook to resize handle. We simply get to mix in functionality to an existing component and be in full control of the values that get added to our scope. It's this control and flexibility of hooks that led me to creating my own React library LocalBoast, which you can find on NPM and GitHub, linked below. It's being built with the goal of providing massive functionality with minimal effort to the developer, all through simple hooks. I already mentioned a hook that allows any arbitrary string to be middle truncated, but what about something a bit flashier? Like a hook that animates the characters of a string over time as they change, to give you a retro playback effect. Or a single hook that enables your app to run a Twitch chatbot in the end user's browser and control your app based on what gets put into chat. That's in there too, and can be so easily added to any app because of hooks, linked below. My library is in its very early days, and outside of YouTube, I'm primarily working on expanding that library and my website, localboast.com, which I do live on Twitch and YouTube 3 times a week. So if you have any interest in seeing that development, or picking my brain about anything related to what I've talked about today, consider subscribing, or following me on Twitch to see when I go live. Or just jump into my Discord at the link below. We've got a very, very small but passionate community, and we'd love to have you. But either way, just remember to keep making the web more interesting with everything you build, and don't be afraid to boast about it.